The birth of gaming. The birth of Atari started after a company called Syzygy Engineering was formed by Nolan Bushnell and Samuel Ted Dabney. One of the company's goals was to make an arcade game version of a computer game that Bushnell played while he was younger, called Space War. Bushnell and Dabney renamed the game to Computer Space. They added fiberglass to encase the computer, and painted the machines various colors like red, blue, yellow, and green. The name Syzygy Co. was already taken, so Bushnell changed the name to Atari, a form of checkmate in one of his favorite games, the Chinese chess-like game Go. They then hired Alan Alcorn, the programmer who created one of the first arcade machine games, Pong. Pong was based off of the tennis game from the Magnavox Odyssey, an older console made by Ralph Baer. Pong became one of the most commonly known video games, adding onto the frontier of home gaming consoles. Atari made more games to satisfy more and more consumers, and different home console companies did the same thing. Everyone was rushing to get the most money from consumers. Companies started making more games while the quality of them went down. Some companies fell, like Atari, because of the worst quality games, and others, still standing, waiting for the moment to sell and grow their own companies.
Rise of Nintendo. The Nintendo Entertainment System, or Famicom as it was called in Japan, was created in 1983 and imported to the US around Christmas time 1985. It ended up being a big hit, selling 60 million copies, creating games like Super Mario Bros., Metroid, and The Legend of Zelda, being only $90 compared to the Atari's $200. The NES ended up being discontinued in 1995, 10 years after the Famicom released. It left quite the legacy, boosting Nintendo from the moderate toy and card game company to one of, if not the most popular video game company in the world. Though it did not have much competition before or after Nintendo dominated the video game industry. While gaming was getting more and more popular throughout the world, it was getting more advanced as well. It went from arcade games to home consoles, and a more recent invention, portable gaming. The main icon for this new style of experiencing video games came in 1989. It was called the Game Boy. There were a lot of portable consoles before it, but they had their flaws, like the Game & Watch, which only had one game per Game & Watch, and of course its timeless clock function. There were others even before that, but none of them gained as much traction as the Milton Bradley Microvision, which made 10 years prior and had 5 million sales to its name. The Game & Watch line did make 30 million sales as well, but the Game Boy topped it all with 120 million sales. It improved everything, with extremely low power consumption next to the Sega Game Gear, which had a battery life of 3 to 5 hours on 6 AA batteries, and interchangeable cartridges, which was not new but a welcome addition, and revolutionary games such as Kirby's debut, Kirby's Dream Land, and Pokemon series debut as well, both of which are franchises that are still living on to this day. It also used the D-pad, which helped popularize it along with the NES controller. It really did improve the gameplay in a lot of cases. There is one more aspect I would like to talk about, though. It is the screen. Nintendo was approached by Citizen during the Game Boy's development with a choice of a color screen or a monochrome screen. Gunpei Yokoi wanted to keep it simple to improve battery life, so he chose to go with the monochrome screen. Then, Sharp, a company Nintendo had worked with before, had held a meeting and basically told them that if they worked with Citizen, Sharp would no longer help Nintendo. Ever. So, Nintendo basically ghosted Citizen and went with Sharp's now iconic grayish green screen. It worked really well, and though the Game Boy was far inferior compared to the Sega Game Gear with its backlit color screen, Nintendo still had better games, even though it required direct lighting to see. Because of this, aspects of the Game Boy were kept and revised throughout Nintendo's handhelds, all the way to the Switch. Unfortunately, Gunpei Yokoi died in a bike accident in 1997.
Sega Strikes Back. While Nintendo was busy dominating the games industry, another company was on their way up the ranks. Sega. Their Sega Master System was not very successful due to the NES, blowing its competitors out of the water. But Sega had a trick up their sleeve. 16-bit technology. It looked better than Nintendo's classic 8-bit, but there was just one problem. Nintendo had better games. During the reign of the NES, Nintendo had created series like Metroid and The Legend of Zelda, while popularizing the Mario series. Meanwhile, one person was sought out by Sega of America, Tom Kalinske. He was already famous for helping create Flintstones Vitamins and the He-Man action figure line. After being hired, he pitched his idea to the higher-ups at Sega Japan to not only be more aggressive and direct towards Nintendo in their advertising, but to also create their own mascot to rival Mario. The higher-ups at Sega Japan didn't agree with him at all, but they let him do whatever he wanted. The advertising was hit or miss, but the mascot idea was a whole different story. One of the programmers at Sega Japan had figured out how to make an object on screen move fast. So there was a contest among Sega to come up with something that could, well, move fast. It came down to a chicken and a hedgehog. Sonic the Hedgehog. Sonic won the contest and appeared in Sega's next game, Sonic the Hedgehog. It was a major success, and so was the advertising. It released in 1991, the same year as the SNES, Nintendo's new 16-bit console, and Super Mario World. At this point, you were either a Sega kid or a Nintendo kid. Many playground wars were started over this. Eventually, 3D gaming started being theorized, and Nintendo and Sega were racing to create the first 3D console. Sony was a television manufacturer and had worked with both Sega and Nintendo in the past, but were now making their own 3D console. Sega was approached by Silicon Graphics, who had made a 64-bit CPU, but the higher-ups at Sega Japan didn't want the CPU, which surprised Tom. So in an act of spite, he pointed them towards Nintendo, with them then using it in the Nintendo 64. But now Sega was panicking. They were working on a console before 3D started being theorized. Only issue was, it was 32-bit, perfectly capable of 3D, but Nintendo now had a 64-bit CPU. So they went with the obvious solution and stuck two 32-bit CPU chips in there. You really can't make this stuff up. Fast forward to E3 1994, and Nintendo, Sega, and the newcomer Sony were there to present their take on 3D gaming. Nintendo was up first, showing off the Nintendo 64, but it was mostly just a graphic showcase. Then Sega was up. They unveiled the Sega Saturn. It had 64-bit graphics like the Nintendo 64, but since there were two 32-bit chips shoved in there, it was A, hard to develop for, and B, its price skyrocketed to $400. People at E3 1994 were not happy about this. Then Sony came up to unveil the Sony PlayStation. Everything about it brought major competition to its competitors, the disc-based architecture and the smaller, more compact design. But the only thing they changed was the price. It was rumored that the Sony PlayStation was going to be $400, like the Sega Saturn. But after they saw the negative recession to Sega's price, they lowered it. Now it was time to present. The representative walked up there and ignored the entire script, only to say one thing and one thing only. $299. The crowd went wild, and it really showed in the PlayStation sales. It became the best-selling console that generation, selling 102 million units, only to then make the best-selling console of all time a few years later, the PlayStation 2, selling 155 million units. Nintendo did decently with the Nintendo 64, but Sega was screwed. They eventually abandoned the Sega Saturn a few years later, and moved on to create the Sega Dreamcast. It failed as well, and soon they filed for bankruptcy. They were at the top with the Sega Genesis, and it was glorious. Now they work with Nintendo, Sony, and Microsoft as a third-party developer.